The parched earth cracked beneath Yates Northrop's boots as he stared blankly at the withered remains of what had once been the most productive cattle ranch in Valentine County, Texas. 3 years of drought had reduced his inheritance to dust, his cattle to bones, and his faith to ashes. It was the summer of 1876, and while the rest of the nation celebrated its centennial with fanfare and optimism, Yates could only count his losses and curse the God who had abandoned him. "Ain't no point praying anymore," he muttered to himself, kicking at the dry soil that had once sprouted green grass for his herd. Man can't live on empty promises. Yates had been 25 when his father died, leaving him the Double N Ranch just outside Fort Stockton. Back then, the skies had been generous, the land forgiving. Now, at 29, his once youthful face had hardened into a permanent scowl, his blue eyes dulled by disappointment. His strong jaw was perpetually clenched, hidden beneath a beard he'd grown more out of neglect than choice. The last of his ranch hands had left 2 months ago when he could no longer pay them. All that remained was his faithful horse, Mescal, and his cattle dog, Chance. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and most folks in Fort Stockton had written him off as a lost cause, a man too stubborn to admit defeat and move on. Yates entered his cabin, the floors creaking beneath his weight. He removed his hat, revealing dark blonde hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. On the mantel sat a Bible his mother had given him before consumption took her when he was just a boy. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the drought began. What was the point? God wasn't listening. He poured himself a generous helping of whiskey, his evening ritual of self-medication. As he raised the glass to his lips, a knock at the door startled him. "Mr. Northrop," a woman's voice called from outside. "Mr. Northrop, are you home?" Frowning, Yates set down his glass and opened the door. Standing before him was a woman he'd never seen before, clutching a small leather-bound book to her chest. She was perhaps 25, with chestnut hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet and warm brown eyes that regarded him with more kindness than he deserved. "Ruby Wilson," she introduced herself with a gentle smile. "I'm the new schoolteacher in Fort Stockton. I've been visiting all the outlying farms and ranches to introduce myself." Yates stared at her, momentarily forgetting his manners. It had been months since he'd spoken to anyone besides the shopkeeper and the banker who was threatening to foreclose on his land. "There ain't any children here," he said flatly. "Just me." Ruby's smile didn't falter. "I'm also collecting books for the school library. I thought perhaps you might have some to spare." "Books?" Yates almost laughed. "Madam, I barely have food to spare." For the first time, Ruby's confident demeanor wavered. She glanced past him into the sparse cabin, taking in the empty shelves and bare walls. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't realize." "That the Double N is failing," Yates finished for her. "Don't worry, everyone else in town knows it." Instead of retreating as he expected, Ruby squared her shoulders. "Actually, Mr. Northrop, I was going to say I didn't realize you might need help. Is there anything I can do?" Yates was taken aback by her directness. "Unless you can make it rain, Miss Wilson, I reckon not." As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. Both of them turned toward the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering over the mountains. "Well," Ruby said with a smile that reached her eyes, "perhaps I have more influence than I thought." For the first time in months, Yates felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "That remains to be seen." The sky darkened rapidly as they stood there, the air growing heavy with moisture. Ruby glanced at the gathering clouds with concern. "I should head back before it starts," she said, turning toward her horse, a gentle dappled mare tethered to his porch rail. "It's 5 miles to town," Yates said, surprising himself with his concern for this stranger. "That storm's moving fast. You won't make it back before it hits." Another rumble, closer this time. Ruby bit her lip, clearly weighing her options. "You're welcome to wait it out here," Yates found himself offering, though his cabin was hardly fit for visitors. Ruby hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Northrop. That's very kind." As they led her horse to the small barn, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time they reached the cabin door, the heavens had opened, and water poured down in sheets, drumming on the roof with an intensity that made conversation difficult. Yates stood at the window, watching as the parched earth greedily drank in the moisture. It was too late for his crops this season, but for the first time in years he felt a flicker of hope. "It's beautiful," Ruby said, coming to stand beside him. "Like the land is coming back to life." Yates glanced at her, taking in her profile as she watched the rain. "It'll take more than one storm to save this ranch," he said, but the bitterness had drained from his voice. "One rain doesn't end a drought," Ruby agreed, turning to face him. "But it's a start, isn't it?" Something in her gaze made Yates feel as though she wasn't just talking about the weather. The storm lasted for hours, forcing Ruby to stay for supper. Yates was embarrassed by the meager fare he could offer: beans, hardtack, and coffee, but Ruby ate without complaint, seeming genuinely interested as she asked about the ranch's history. "My father built this place from nothing," Yates told her, surprised at how easily the words came after so long keeping to himself. "He drove his first herd up from South Texas in '48, met my mother when he stopped in Fort Stockton for supplies. They were married a month later." "That's romantic," Ruby said, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "I suppose it was," Yates conceded. "They were happy far as I could tell, even when times were hard. And they were often hard. This is West Texas, Miss Wilson. The land gives and takes as it pleases." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "But nothing like these past few years. Never seen it this bad." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "Yet you stayed." It wasn't a question, but Yates answered anyway. "This land is all I know, all I have left of them." By the time the rain stopped, night had fallen, and the roads would be mud pits. Yates insisted Ruby take his bed while he slept on a pallet by the hearth. She protested, but eventually relented, thanking him for his hospitality. As he lay awake listening to the occasional drip from the eaves, Yates realized this was the first time in 3 years he'd fallen asleep without the aid of whiskey. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than despair when thinking about the dawn. Morning came with surprising clarity, the air washed clean by the night's rain. Yates rose early, as was his habit, to find Ruby already awake, her hair neatly pinned, standing on his porch watching the sunrise. "I hope I didn't wake you," she said as he joined her. Yates shook his head. "Been up with the sun since I was a boy." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as golden light spread across the land. The dusty brown landscape of yesterday now glistened with moisture, and in the distance, a faint green haze suggested life stirring beneath the surface. "Your land is beautiful, Mr. Northrop," Ruby said softly. "Yates," he corrected her. "Seems strange to be so formal after you've slept under my roof." Ruby smiled. "Yates, then, and I'm Ruby." After a simple breakfast, Yates saddled her mare and his own horse, insisting on escorting her back to town. The roads were muddy as expected, but navigable, and Yates found himself enjoying the ride more than he'd enjoyed anything in recent memory. "What brought you to Fort Stockton?" he asked as they rode. "It's not exactly the most exciting place in Texas." Ruby laughed, a bright sound that seemed to complement the freshness of the morning. "I wanted to go where I was needed. The town advertised for a teacher, and here I am." "Just like that. You didn't know anyone here?" Not a soul, she admitted. But that's part of the adventure, isn't it? Meeting new people, finding your place. Yates studied her, trying to understand this woman who had appeared on his doorstep like a harbinger of rain. Most folks are running from something when they come out this way. Ruby met his gaze steadily, or towards something. When they reached Fort Stockton, Yates was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. He hadn't ventured into town in weeks, and here he was escorting the new schoolteacher, both of them mud splattered from the ride. "Thank you for seeing me safely back," Ruby said as they stopped outside the small boarding house where she was staying. "Least I could do," Yates replied, suddenly self-conscious about his worn clothing and unkempt appearance. Before he could turn to leave, Ruby touched his arm. "The school term starts next week, but I've been organizing books in the meantime. If you'd like to stop by, I could use some help building shelves." Yates hesitated. He had plenty of work waiting back at the ranch, not that it would amount to much without rain. Still, the thought of spending more time in Ruby's company was unexpectedly appealing. "I might do that," he said, non-committal. Ruby's smile suggested she saw right through him. "I'll be there every day. The door's always open." 3 days later, Yates found himself standing outside the one-room schoolhouse, his hat in his hands. He'd bathed in the creek, trimmed his beard, and put on his least threadbare shirt. Still, he felt out of place as he watched Ruby through the window, arranging books on a makeshift shelf. Before he could lose his nerve, he knocked on the open door. Ruby turned, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Yates, you came," said I might, he replied, stepping inside. The schoolhouse was modest but clean, with rows of simple desks facing a larger teacher's desk. The walls were bare except for a map of the United States and a chalkboard. "I'm glad you did," Ruby said. "These shelves are proving more stubborn than expected." Yates examined the half-assembled bookcase, immediately spotting the problem. "You've got the supports backward. Here, let me show you." For the next several hours, Yates worked on the bookshelves while Ruby sorted through her collection. They fell into easy conversation, with Ruby sharing stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania and her teaching experiences in St. Louis before coming west. "My father was a carpenter," she explained as she watched Yates work. "He would have appreciated your skill." "Was?" Yates asked, noting her use of the past tense. Ruby's expression grew solemn. "He and my mother died in a fire 2 years ago. Our home, their workshop, everything was lost." "I'm sorry," Yates said, genuinely meaning it. "That's a hard thing," Ruby nodded. "It was, still is some days, but they raised me to look forward, not back, so that's what I try to do." Yates thought about his own response to loss, the retreat into isolation, the bitterness, the abandonment of hope. Ruby had faced tragedy too, yet here she was, building something new in a strange town. "You're stronger than most," he said simply. Ruby looked at him with those perceptive brown eyes. "Strength comes in different forms, Yates. Endurance is its own kind of strength. You've endured a lot." By the time the shelves were finished, the sun was setting. Ruby insisted on treating Yates to dinner at the small hotel restaurant as thanks. It was the first proper meal he'd had in months, and he was surprised to find himself enjoying not just the food but the company and conversation. As they walked back to the schoolhouse where his horse was tethered, Ruby paused. "There's a social at the church this Sunday after services. Would you consider attending?" Yates stiffened. "I haven't set foot in that church in 3 years." "I'm not asking you to come for religious reasons," Ruby clarified. "Just for the company, for the community." "I'm not much for socializing these days." Ruby studied him in the fading light. "Isolation doesn't heal anything, Yates. It just lets the wound fester." Her words hit uncomfortably close to home. "I'll think about it," he said, which was more than he would have offered a week ago. That seemed to satisfy her. "That's all I ask." The ride back to his ranch gave Yates plenty of time to reflect. The land was already changing after just one good rain. Patches of green were emerging from the brown earth, and the creek that ran through his property was flowing again, albeit weakly. It wouldn't be enough to save his cattle if he still had them, but it was a change nonetheless. Just as Ruby had changed something in him, he realized. She had brought more than rain to his parched existence. Sunday morning arrived with another storm, gentler than the first but steady. Yates stood on his porch watching the clouds, thinking about Ruby's invitation. He hadn't planned to go. What business did he have mingling with folks who'd written him off? But the rain seemed like a sign. Before he could talk himself out of it, Yates bathed, shaved his beard down to a more presentable length, and put on his one good suit, left over from better days. It was loose on his frame now, but it would have to do. The church was packed when he arrived, the service already in progress. He slipped into the back row, keeping his head down, but not before catching Ruby's eye from where she sat near the front. Her smile of surprise and delight made the discomfort of being there almost worthwhile. Reverend Johnson's sermon was about faith in times of hardship, words Yates had heard and rejected countless times over the past 3 years. But today, something penetrated his defenses. Faith isn't believing that God will give you what you want, the Reverend was saying. It's trusting that whatever happens, you are not abandoned, that even in the desert there are springs of water if you know where to look. Yates thought about the rain that had come just as Ruby arrived at his door. Coincidence, surely. And yet, after the service, Ruby found him before he could escape. "You came," she said, her face glowing with what looked remarkably like pride. "Said I'd think about it," Yates replied, trying to sound gruff but failing miserably. "And the social," she pressed. "Will you stay?" The church hall was filling with people, families setting out dishes for the potluck dinner. Yates felt conspicuously empty-handed. "I didn't bring anything." "Your presence is more than enough," Ruby assured him, taking his arm and guiding him inside. To Yates's surprise, not everyone treated him like a pariah. Old Mrs. Henderson asked after his health. The blacksmith, Jim Carlson, discussed the weather and its effects on the cattle ranges. Even the banker, Mr. Peterson, was cordial, making no mention of the looming foreclosure. And then there was Ruby, introducing him to people as if he were a valued friend rather than the failing rancher everyone pitied. She stayed by his side, her presence a buffer against the awkwardness he felt. "See," she said as they ate at a corner table. "Not so terrible, is it?" Yates had to admit it wasn't. "These folks have short memories. 3 years of me keeping to myself and they act like nothing happened." "Maybe they're just glad to see you rejoining the living," Ruby suggested. "People care more than you think, Yates." He wasn't entirely convinced, but he was beginning to wonder if his isolation had been self-imposed rather than forced upon him. As the social wound down, Reverend Johnson approached their table. "Good to see you, Yates. It's been too long." Yates nodded uncomfortably. "Reverend, I hear we have Miss Wilson to thank for bringing you back to us," the Reverend continued, smiling at Ruby. "I merely extended an invitation," Ruby demurred. "Yates made the choice to come." "Well, whatever the reason, we're glad to have you, both of you." The Reverend's eyes twinkled with something that made Yates suspect the town was already gossiping about him and Ruby. "And Yates, if you ever want to talk, my door is always open." After the Reverend moved on, Yates turned to Ruby. "People are talking, aren't they, about us?" Ruby blushed slightly. "Small towns run on gossip. Does it bother you?" Yates considered this. "Reckon there are worse things for folks to say about me than that I'm keeping company with the prettiest schoolteacher this town has ever seen." Now Ruby's blush deepened, but her smile was pleased. Careful, Mr. Northrop. That almost sounds like a compliment. Maybe it is, he admitted. Been a long time since I've had reason to pay compliments. On the ride back to his ranch, with Ruby beside him on her mare, Yates felt a peculiar lightness in his chest. The land around them was transforming. What had been dust a week ago was now showing signs of green life pushing through the soil. It's like the whole world is waking up, Ruby observed, echoing his thoughts. One good rain doesn't end a drought, Yates reminded her, repeating her own words from days earlier. Ruby glanced at him, her eyes dancing. No, but it's a start, and there's more rain in those clouds. She pointed to the horizon, where another bank of dark clouds was gathering. At the turnoff to his ranch, Yates hesitated. The proper thing would be to see Ruby safely back to town, but he wasn't ready for the day to end. Would you like to see the creek? He asked impulsively. The rains brought it back some. Ruby's smile was answer enough. The creek that cut through Yates's property had been little more than a dry bed for most of the past 3 years. Now it bubbled with shallow but clear water, nurturing the roots of the cottonwoods that lined its banks. They dismounted and walked along the edge, Ruby kneeling occasionally to examine wildflower shoots pushing through the mud. Life is persistent, she said, gently touching a tiny green sprout. It waits for its moment, then reaches for the sun. Yates watched her, struck by the care in her movements, the wonder in her eyes. You see beauty in things most folks would overlook. My father taught me that, Ruby said, rising to her feet. He said God speaks in small things as well as grand ones. In a seed sprouting as much as in a mountain rising. And you believe that, after losing your parents the way you did. Ruby was quiet for a moment, her gaze on the distant hills. Faith isn't absence of doubt, Yates. It's choosing hope despite it. She turned to face him. What made you lose yours? No one had asked him so directly before. People in town had watched his decline, had seen his absence from church, had noticed his increasing bitterness, but no one had simply asked. Started with the drought, Yates said slowly. Watching my cattle die, no matter how hard I worked or how much I prayed. Then came the bank loans I couldn't repay, hired hands leaving, neighbors giving up and moving east. He paused, digging at the damp soil with the toe of his boot. Felt like God had turned his back on this land, on me. And now, Ruby asked softly. With the rain coming back, Yates looked around at the greening landscape, then at Ruby, whose arrival had coincided with the break in the drought. Now I'm not sure what to think. Ruby stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. Maybe you don't need to figure it all out at once. Maybe it's enough to just notice the changes. In the land. In yourself. There was something in her gaze that made Yates's heart quicken. Without planning to, he reached out and took her hand. It was small in his, but strong, the hands of someone who worked hard. You've brought a lot of changes, Ruby Wilson, he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd forgotten how to express. Ruby squeezed his hand. The rain was coming anyway, she said with a smile. I just happened to arrive first. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and they both looked up to see dark clouds rolling in fast. We should get back, Yates said reluctantly, not wanting this moment to end but practical enough to know they shouldn't be caught in another downpour. They rode quickly, reaching the ranch house just as the first heavy drops began to fall. This time there was no hesitation as they stabled the horses and ran for the shelter of the cabin, laughing as the rain chased them inside. Yates built a fire while Ruby wrung water from her skirts. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin a different kind of warmth was growing. I've been thinking, Yates said as they sat before the fire, mugs of coffee warming their hands. If this rain keeps up, I might be able to salvage something of the ranch. Ruby looked at him with interest. What would you do first? Buy some cattle come spring. Not a full herd, just enough to start building again. He hadn't allowed himself to make plans in so long that the words felt foreign on his tongue. The bank's threatening foreclosure, but Peterson seemed almost friendly today. Might be he'd consider renegotiating if he thinks there's a chance I could pay eventually. That sounds like hope talking, Ruby observed. Yates met her gaze. Maybe it is. The rain continued through the night, forcing Ruby to stay once again. This time, however, there was a different quality to their evening together, a warmth, an awareness, a sense of possibility neither of them acknowledged aloud but both felt keenly. In the morning, when Yates insisted on riding with Ruby back to town, it was with the promise to return the following day to help her finish preparing the schoolhouse for the start of classes. And so a pattern began. Yates divided his time between working his land, which responded eagerly to the continuing rains, and helping Ruby in town. He built more shelves for the schoolhouse, repaired the roof where it leaked, and constructed a small covered area where children could eat their lunches in the shade. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Whispers followed them, but they were largely kind. The failing rancher and the new schoolteacher made an unlikely pair, but there was something about seeing them together that gave people hope. If Yates Northrop, who had sunk so low, could find his way back, perhaps the whole region could recover from the drought's devastation. As summer turned to fall, the rains became more regular. Yates's land continued its transformation, and so did Yates himself. The perpetual frown eased from his face. He regained some of the weight he'd lost during the lean years. And most notably, he began attending church again, sitting beside Ruby, his deep voice joining hers during the hymns. It was after one such service in late October that Yates finally spoke to Reverend Johnson about the crisis of faith he'd endured. "I felt abandoned," Yates confessed as they sat in the empty church. "Like all my work, all my prayers, meant nothing." The Reverend nodded understandingly. "The hardest tests of faith are the ones that strike at the heart of what we think we deserve. We believe that if we're good, if we work hard, we should be rewarded. But the rain falls on the just and unjust alike, as does the drought." Yates thought about this. "So what's the point of faith, then, if it doesn't protect you from suffering? Faith isn't a shield against hardship, Yates. It's a wellspring during it." The Reverend glanced toward the door where Ruby was waiting patiently. "Sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, though it may not be what we thought we wanted." Yates followed his gaze, watching as Ruby spoke animatedly with one of her young students. She caught his eye and smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had begun to feel like home. "I think I'm starting to understand that," Yates said quietly. November brought cooler weather and the first real test of Yates and Ruby's growing relationship. Mr. Peterson from the bank called Yates into his office to discuss the status of his loans. "The situation remains dire, Mr. Northrop," Peterson said, reviewing the ledger. "Despite the improved conditions, your debt has only increased with interest." Yates sat stiffly in the chair across from the banker's desk. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Peterson. But I've got a plan to start rebuilding come spring. If you could extend the terms—" Peterson cut him off with a raised hand. "I've extended terms 3 times already. The bank's investors are losing patience." Yates felt the old familiar despair threatening to return, but he pushed it away. "What if I sold part of the land? The north section, maybe. Keep enough to run a smaller operation." The banker considered this. "That might satisfy the immediate debt, yes, but it would leave you with significantly reduced assets." "Better than losing it all," Yates said firmly. Peterson nodded slowly. "I'll draw up the papers for your consideration. But Mr. Northrop, I would advise you to think carefully about whether holding on to what remains is truly in your best interest. A fresh start elsewhere might. No, Yates interrupted, more forcefully than he'd intended. This land is my heritage. I'm not abandoning it. As he left the bank, Yates was so preoccupied with his thoughts that he nearly collided with Ruby, who was just entering the general store. "Yates, what's wrong?" she asked, immediately sensing his distress. He explained the situation as they walked toward the schoolhouse, his frustration growing with each word. 3 good months of rain and it's like nothing's changed. They still want to take my land. Ruby listened attentively, her brow furrowed in concern. "Selling part of the property sounds reasonable," she offered. "You could still make a living with what remains." "It's not just about making a living," Yates said, struggling to articulate what the ranch meant to him. "It's about belonging somewhere, having roots. That land is the only connection I have to my parents, to my history." They had reached the schoolhouse, empty now that classes were done for the day. Ruby unlocked the door and led him inside, where a small stove kept the worst of the chill at bay. "I understand that, Yates," she said as they sat at one of the student desks. "But sometimes holding too tightly to the past prevents us from embracing the future." Something in her tone made Yates look at her sharply. "What are you saying?" Ruby met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying that perhaps your worth isn't tied to that specific piece of land. That perhaps there might be other ways to honor your parents' memory while building something new." "Easy for you to say," Yates replied, immediately regretting the harshness in his voice. "You chose to leave your home behind. After it was destroyed," Ruby reminded him quietly. "I didn't have the luxury of choosing to stay." Shame washed over Yates. "I'm sorry, that was unfair of me." Ruby placed her hand over his. "We all face difficult choices, Yates. The question is whether we let them define us or refine us." That evening, as Yates rode back to his ranch alone, he reflected on Ruby's words. The land stretched out around him, greener now but still bearing the scars of drought. Like him, it was recovering but changed. He thought about the northern section. He was considering selling the rocky terrain his father had always said was better suited for goats than cattle. Letting it go would hurt his pride more than his operations. And then there was Ruby. In just a few months, she had become essential to him in a way he hadn't thought possible after so much loss. When he imagined his future now, she was in it. But he'd never spoken of this, never dared to hope she might feel the same. The next day, Yates rode into Fort Stockton with a determination that surprised even himself. His first stop was the bank, where he agreed to sell the northern section of his ranch to cover his debt, with the condition that the remaining property would be free and clear, the mortgage considered paid in full. His second stop was the general store, where he spent more money than was prudent on a small silver brooch shaped like a raindrop, set with a single pearl. And his final stop was the schoolhouse, where Ruby was dismissing her students for the day. She looked up in surprise as he entered, waiting until the last child had left before speaking. "Yates, I didn't expect to see you today after. Well, after yesterday. I've been thinking about what you said," he began, suddenly nervous now that the moment had arrived. "About choices defining or refining us." Ruby nodded, her expression cautious. And I've made some decisions." Yates took a deep breath. "I'm selling part of the ranch to clear my debt. It's not ideal, but it means I can keep the heart of the property, start rebuilding properly." Relief softened Ruby's features. "That sounds wise." "There's more," Yates continued, stepping closer. "These past months, ever since you showed up at my door with the rain, you've changed everything, Ruby. The way I see the world, the way I see myself, the way I think about the future." Ruby's eyes widened slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. "Yates, I don't have much to offer right now," he pressed on, "but I will. And what I do have, my heart, my hands, whatever strength I possess is yours if you want it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the small brooch. "I know it's not much and maybe I'm being presumptuous," but Ruby interrupted him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes shining, "and you're not being presumptuous at all." Yates felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "So you might consider." "That is, would you think about?" Ruby laughed softly. "Are you trying to ask if I'll marry you, Yates Northrop? Making a terrible job of it, aren't I?" he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "On the contrary," Ruby said, taking his hand in hers. "I think you're doing just fine. And yes, I will marry you. Not because you need saving, but because together, I believe we can build something beautiful." The kiss they shared was gentle but filled with promise, like the first rain after a long drought. They were married on Christmas Day, 1876, in the Fort Stockton Church, with Reverend Johnson officiating. The small building was decorated with pine boughs and red berries, and despite the winter chill, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove in the corner. Ruby wore a simple dress of deep blue, with Yates's silver raindrop brooch pinned at her throat. Yates stood tall in a new suit, his face clean-shaven for the occasion, his eyes clear and hopeful as he recited his vows. The townsfolk who attended, and nearly everyone did, remarked on the transformation in Yates. Gone was the bitter, isolated man who had withdrawn from the community. In his place stood someone who looked to the future with confidence, who spoke of blessings rather than curses. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers, Mr. Peterson approached with his wife. "Congratulations to you both," the banker said, shaking Yates's hand. "Miss Wilson, Mrs. Northrop, now, I understand you'll be continuing your teaching position." "For the remainder of the school year, yes," Ruby confirmed. "After that, we'll see what's needed both at the school and at the ranch." "A sensible approach," Peterson approved. He lowered his voice slightly. "And Yates, I wanted you to know the sale of your northern section has generated significant interest from several buyers. It seems the railroad might be considering a route through that area. You may have sold at just the right time." Yates exchanged a surprised glance with Ruby. "Is that so?" "Well, sometimes luck turns in a man's favor, I suppose." "Indeed it does," Peterson agreed. "Though in my experience, luck favors those who persevere through hardship." As the banker moved away, Ruby squeezed Yates's hand. "Did you hear that? The land you were most reluctant to part with might turn out to be the most valuable to sell." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Yates murmured, the phrase coming naturally to him now in a way it wouldn't have 6 months ago. That evening, as they drove the wagon back to what was now their ranch, their home, snow began to fall, the first Fort Stockton had seen in years. The delicate flakes settled on Ruby's bonnet and on Yates's shoulders as he helped her down from the wagon. "More moisture for the land," Ruby observed, tilting her face up to catch a snowflake on her tongue. Yates watched her, his heart full. "You really did bring the rain with you," he said, drawing her into his arms. Ruby laughed, the sound bright in the winter stillness. "And you found your faith again. It seems we've been good for each other." "The best," Yates agreed, kissing her as the snow continued to fall around them, blanketing the once parched earth with promise. Spring of 1877 brought abundant rain and new life to the Northrop Ranch. Yates used the money from the sale of his northern section wisely, investing in a small but healthy herd of cattle and making necessary repairs to the ranch buildings. Ruby continued teaching until the end of the school year in May, after which she devoted herself fully to building their home together. The railroad did indeed purchase the land Yates had sold, paying a premium that allowed them to expand their operations sooner than expected. By summer, The Double N Ranch was well on its way to becoming one of the most productive in the county again. In July, as they celebrated their first Independence Day as a married couple at a town picnic, Ruby shared news that completed Yates's journey from despair to joy. They were expecting their first child. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion as they sat beneath a cottonwood tree, away from the festivities. Ruby nodded, her face glowing. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We should welcome our little one sometime in February." Yates placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life in the land, in their marriage, and now growing within Ruby. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. Ruby cradled his face in her hands. "For what?" "For bringing rain to my life when I needed it most," Yates said simply. "For helping me find faith again in God, in myself, in the future." "We found it together," Ruby corrected him softly, "and we'll keep finding it day by day, season by season." As they rejoined the town celebration, Yates looked out over the land that had once seemed cursed, but now flourished with renewed purpose. Like him, it had endured, waiting for the rain that would eventually come. And like the land, Yates Northrop had been transformed not by forgetting the hardships of the past, but by finding the courage to embrace the blessings of the present and the promise of the future, with Ruby by his side through drought and rainfall alike. Their child, a healthy boy they named Adam, was born on a cold February morning in 1878, bringing even more joy to their flourishing ranch. As the years passed, they would welcome two more children, a daughter, Hope, in 1880, and another son, Samuel, in 1883. The Double N Ranch grew and prospered under their care, becoming known throughout the region for its resilience and innovation. But whenever new settlers would ask about the secret to their success, Yates would simply smile and glance at Ruby, who had taught him that the most precious gift isn't rain for the land, but love for the soul, a blessing that, once found, sustains through every season.